A great man once said, "I don't think I have what it takes to make a great game. I think I'm better at telling a story." That man's name was Hironobu Sakaguchi. Personally, I don't think I have what it takes either to make a good YouTube channel or a great podcast. I do ever think that I'm a good storyteller, and I've been told my whole life that I'm pretty decent at telling a story, so why not tell my stories here, right? My name's Mike Meeker. Some people know me as LordGlarp, and this is Fantasy Tales. It's a show about great games and fantastic stories. This first episode is maybe not so cleverly titled A Tale of Fantasy. I mean, why not? What's a better place to start than the actual beginning of my stories and the stories that I'm looking forward to telling on this platform? The beginning I'm talking about, though, isn't necessarily the beginning of gaming as a whole, or even really the beginning of Final Fantasy. Rather, the beginning of my personal story of gaming, and that story started in 1994 with the release of Final Fantasy VI. Though I wouldn't get my hands on this absolute masterpiece of graphics, soundtrack, story, and characters and setting until about 1998 when I turned 10 years old. Honestly, I couldn't tell you how this game got into our house. I believe it was either left there by my uncle, who would later go on to introduce me to titles like Legend of Dragoon and my absolute favorite game, Final Fantasy VII. Or back in those days, if you had a friend who also had the same console as you, you'd usually lend cartridges out to each other and completely forget that you did so because you were kids. Interestingly enough, I had just finished seeing a friend of mine play Super Mario RPG. Although I didn't know at the time that game was also developed by Square Enix, just seeing that game played out really made me thirst and crave a game like it, a game with a lot of progression, a game where your characters grew and they grew stronger. And there was almost a bit of storytelling, even in just like the menus and the UI, because you could remember where you came from and see where you're at now. And you could remember the gear that you had and the weapons you used and the powers you had at the beginning of the game and how just useless they were now. Uh, it was amazing because there was storytelling in so many different ways. It wasn't just the story of the game, which was amazing. There was like equipment storytelling, gear story. But enough about me and my childhood and Super Mario RPG, because that's really not what we're talking about. Today's tale will take us way, way back before the era of Final Fantasy, before Squaresoft, and even before Hironobu Sakaguchi was hired out of a salon by a man obsessed with women's apparel. Yeah, this thing gets weird. It gets really weird, but it's also really cool. Our tale really begins at a private research university in Shinjuku, Tokyo. Founded on the 21st of October in 1882 by a samurai scholar who was also a Meiji-era politician, a prince, and would later become the 5th Prime Minister of Japan. I'm talking about Okuma Shingen Obu. I am so sorry if I completely murder these names. I did listen to their pronunciations earlier. It's just, I feel like I don't have all of the vocalization that I need in order to pronounce their names. Also, I'm super nervous and I'm salivating. So this university was the Tokyo Senmon Goku University. A freaking samurai prince who would also become the 5th Prime Minister of Japan founded this university. He's not like part of the tale and it's not super important at the moment, but it gets pretty damn interesting in retrospect after all the context for the rest of this tale is laid out. Attending this university was a young man by the name of Masafumi Miyamoto, who would eventually go on to become the founder of Squaresoft. Our man Miyamoto graduated from the university in 1983, and the university would later graduate many notable alumni, most of which were some of the most notable tech gurus of East Asia over the past century, including 7 prime ministers of Japan, numerous important figures in Japanese literature, and many CEOs that include the former CEO of Sony, Honda, and former chairman of Mitsubishi, the former CEO of Toshiba, the chairman of Samsung, and both the former and current presidents of Nintendo. It's a bit crazy to me to consider that the actions of a former samurai and prince laid the foundations for what would be necessary to give us all of these prolific individuals. Just imagine how much different our world would be if this university didn't exist. I mean, obviously, they could have came from somewhere else. They could have went to a different university. You may have still got the same people, right? Maybe we just wouldn't have Nintendo or Samsung or Sony today if it wasn't for the establishment of this particular university. We certainly wouldn't have Final Fantasy. It's crazy to think about. Shortly after graduation, Miyamoto would go on to work for his father, Kenichi Miyamoto, and his electric power conglomerate. Denyasha was the name of this collaborate. Den means electric or power. Yu means friend. As a programmer in their internal software development division, Miyamoto, despite having a cushy job working for his dad, wasn't interested in working for his father's electric company. Miyamoto spent his days daydreaming of a career in women's clothing manufacturing. Luckily for us, he started his career developing computer games in the software division of his father's company in Yokohama. Miyamoto took it upon himself to build out a video game development corner of his father's company. Although it's not entirely clear if his father knew about any of this going on at the time. Eventually, Miyamoto would open up an internet cafe-like salon in Yokohama. Suzuki began to help Miyamoto find skilled students. They posted a job offer on a classified ad magazine, Form A, which was also first issued by Recruit in 1982, and first met Hironobu Sakaguchi as a job applicant. It gradually became apparent that Suzuki was relatively better at general administrations than Miyamoto. Sakaguchi was a student in the Department of Engineering in Yokohama National University and was a big fan of adventure games, RPGs, and working with Apple's PCs. He soon became fully committed to leading Square's programming teams and finally became the executive director of the Final Fantasy series. But again, that was later on in the story. Just a quick note, Miyamoto wasn't actually a fantastic programmer and really didn't understand computers in general. That was to his own admittance. It took almost no time at all for him to retreat from learning video games and programming and to really take up the mantle of his family's conglomerate as the president of the Miyamoto family. It's also kind of cool to note that his holding company established a women's clothing manufacturing business as well, like he had originally wanted. All of his success would come after walking a painful road in the gaming industry, however. Square's first 2 titles were Death Trap and the sequel Death Trap 2, both designed by part-time employee Hironobu Sakaguchi and released on the PC 8801, also just known as the PC 88. One of the first 8-bit home computer systems and arguably the most popular one of these systems. A system that adjusted for inflation would have set you back the equivalent of $3,686 US dollars, plus about $170 per game on average, in today's money anyway. I guess $60 for a new game doesn't sound that bad. Square released their first Famicom compatible software, Dexter, soon after the introduction of Will for PCs in 1985. This was not an early entry to the Famicom software business. They missed most of the booming period of Famicom, during which other software houses easily earned fortunes. Square's hesitant entry to this emerging tech business was due to the misfit of their self-identity. Creators in Square thought of themselves as creating computer software, and they thought of Square as a computer software company, despite having made a game, despite having made several or a couple games anyway, up to this point. On the other hand, their honest opinion was that Famicom was only a toy for children produced by a toy maker and wasn't worth pursuing. Uh, they couldn't see themselves making anything for this machine. They wanted to make things for the computer. They thought that's where the future was going, which in retrospect, they were correct. Even our main man, Suzuki, had this to say about the decision to not get on board with the Famicom early on. This is his quote. To tell the truth, all of our creators were very unwilling to develop Famicom games. We ignored Famicom from the beginning. We actually played it and found that it was a ton of fun, but we did nothing about Famicom in our labs because it was a toy. In 1986, Miyamoto turned Square into an independent company, separating it from his father's power company, with a focus on making games for the Famicom video game system in Japan. He officially named the company Square Co. Limited. It was around this time that Square became the 7th third-party company to make an official contract with Nintendo to develop and sell Famicom software, following Namco, Hudson, Bandai, and other first movers. Despite making the correct move, they missed the boom, and Square would make nothing for 1.5 years after signing the contract. Sakaguchi eventually became a full-time employee as director of planning and development for the company. Square entered the Japanese video game industry with simple RPGs, racing games, and platformers for Nintendo's Famicom Disk System. A lot of game developers at the time discovered that it was more financially viable to produce as many games as possible within a calendar year than it was to release one really good game. This had to do with Nintendo's internal business model and the way that they set up that model for third parties. We won't go into that with this tale, as it's complicated, and honestly, I wish I hadn't have read as deep into it as I did. Square released 13 titles in 1985. To boost their turnover, they split their teams and released tiny little indistinct games almost every month. In total, they sold a lot of individual copies of the games, but in splitting their resources like that, overhead became huge. And with thin margins under Nintendo's business model, the worst was the rent. Eventually, Square was more or less working just to pay the rent, and they had to deal with the reality of the possibility that bankruptcy in the near future was going to become an inevitability if they kept working like this. Square made a critical decision to move to a shit office in Nuo, the old downtown in Tokyo, and also laid off half of their employees. They concentrated on the remaining 30 members of their team and what little money they had left on making a few more games in hopes of a breakthrough. If this plan didn't prove successful, their only option was to close the company. With only enough resources available to make one more game, Sakaguchi decided that his talents lay in being able to tell a compelling story. And so he began assembling a team that would be able to rescue Square's future in the game industry. He brought together composer Nobu Uematsu, artist Yoshitaka Amno, and Sakaguchi's old friend Tanaka to design a new fantasy role-playing game for the cartridge-based NES system, and drew inspiration from popular fantasy games such as Enix's Dragon Quest, Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda, and the Origin System's Ultima series. Kawadzu was mainly responsible for the battle system and sequences, which he based heavily on the tabletop game Dungeons & Dragons, and the RPG wizardry. For example, enemies' weaknesses to elements such as fire and ice had not been included in Japanese RPGs up until that point. Kawadzu had grown fond of such aspects of Western RPGs and decided to incorporate them into Final Fantasy. He also advocated the player's option to freely choose their own party member classes at the beginning of the game, as he felt, in quote, "The fun in an RPG begins with character creation." It should be noted that Sakaguchi had intended to make a role-playing game for quite a while up to this point, but Square refused to give him permission as it expected low sales of such a product. And really, up to this point, no one had been very successful in the RPG space. Though it's believed that the success of the RPG Dragon Quest in Japan may have caused the company to reconsider its stance. So there we have it. The stage is set. You have a company that originated from a Powerline installation conglomerate that was completely tanking all of their opportunities up to this point to release a good game, a staying game, a lasting game. They just used basically the last of the resources that they had to move to this crap part of Tokyo. The last of the fumes that they were running on now rests solely on this new team and what they called their Final Fantasy. For a period of time, the home video game industry was trapped into a loop of self-deterioration. Customers were becoming much wiser and were making better purchasing decisions, and they were quickly losing faith in developers' ability to release a compelling game, a game that would last. They were sick of buying a new game every single month. A lot of software houses realized this fact, but couldn't stop selling games of low quality as it was their only way of surviving in the current industry crisis. They couldn't make a big, long-lasting game because they had to get those sales every single month. Square's failure up to this point put them in a unique position to be able to develop a single game that they could pour all of their time into. Other developers were still feeling the pressure of needing to release 13 games a year. As it would turn out, being in this specific position at this specific point in time would give the conditions necessary to release a truly fantastic game. Final Fantasy was released on the 18th of December, 1987. Their final shipment for that title was 510,000 copies for nearly 66 million US dollars in today's money. The success of Final Fantasy would not only save Square, but also be the catalyst for the merger of Square and Enix in 2003. Square Enix would then go on to make other widely known games such as Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, Xenogears, Parasite Eve, the Saga series, Vagrant Story, Dragon Quest, Kingdom Hearts, and of course Super Mario RPG. The company would even make breakthroughs in film and television with Tomb Raider, Full Metal Alchemist, Black Butler, Soul Eater, and the Hitman series. From working in the basement of a power company to really redefining what it meant to be an RPG and really becoming the measuring tool at which all other game companies would be measured by gamers on quality of RPG. And really, after researching all of this, one of the biggest takeaways I have is what was happening with the company as they were nearing bankruptcy is pretty reflective of what it's like to play a character in a Final Fantasy game. Usually you're playing someone who is riddled with self-doubt, pain, conflict, confusion in the beginning. The Final Fantasy stories really are about struggling against the odds and relying on each other to overcome those odds. I can't think of a single Final Fantasy game where the main character achieves a ton on his own. The main character in Final Fantasy games is usually, in kind of a weird way in my opinion, one of the weaker or more plain characters, and that really it is the diversity of the group that they surround themselves that pushes their ultimate victory. That's it for Fantasy Tales. I really hope that you enjoyed hearing about Final Fantasy and more backstory to really how this all came together in the end. Really amazing story. I had a ton of fun reading about it and learning about it. If you want to chat more about this topic or other topics that we go over in future Fantasy Tales, please go ahead and drop a comment and I'll respond to every single one of them. Or you can catch me at twitch.tv/LordGlarp. I'm more than likely over there playing a Final Fantasy game or some other RPG. If you enjoyed the tale, I'd like to ask you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It takes 2 seconds and it really helps me in my life in a way that you just can't imagine. Either way, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.